In this episode, we'll take a look at the Earthworks ICON PRO broadcast, streaming, and podcasting microphone. First up, this entire episode is recorded with the ICON PRO. We're running that via XLR cable into my audio interface, which is a Universal Audio Apollo X6. And then we're coming line out of that into my camera, which is a Canon C200, which you see right here. Let's jump right into some samples and some tests.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you were quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you were quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you were quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. First up, let's do a little Sibilance demo. I have a lot of sibilance in my voice. Let's see how this microphone reacts to that. She sells seashells by the seashore. She sells seashells by the seashore. What you're listening for is the kind of sizzling sound when I say the letter S or C. Next up, a test of plosive. So if I say something like, Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers, the question is, how often does it do that sort of boo sound? Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Here I'm probably about, I'd say, 5 inches from the microphone. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. It's also angled at a little bit of an angle up toward my mouth, as opposed to right in front of my mouth. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, talking off to the side just a little bit. It's aimed at the side of my mouth here. Here's a third party. It's actually Shure actually makes this foam filter here. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Let's also demonstrate proximity effect. Proximity effect is a very bassy sound you get when you get up closer on the microphone. So this is something that normally if you get up really close on the microphone, something like this, then you would expect to pick up more bass. And so we're just testing here to see how much more bass there is. To what I'm hearing right now, it's always hard to kind of evaluate your own voice while you're recording, but I'm not hearing a really overwhelming presence boost like you often hear on a lot of other microphones. So this one manages that a little bit better. Next up, we will demonstrate the polar pattern of the microphone. The polar pattern is how sensitive it is on each side of the microphone. So let's take a listen here. So here I'm talking directly into the microphone, and I'm going to turn it so that I'm about 90 degrees off axis from the microphone. Now I am sitting up close to a computer and a big desk, so you will hear some of the sound reflecting off of those surfaces and coming back into the microphone. And then just to sort of try and maintain the same amount of distance, here I am at the back of the microphone, 180 degrees off axis. We'll bring it back here. So now I am 90 degrees off axis from the microphone. And now we're turning it so that I am back on axis with the microphone. So what we're listening for here is, does it make any of the off axis sound colored? Does it sound different if it's off axis versus on axis in terms of the actual timbre of the sound and not just quieter? So that's what we're looking for here. Let me just take a step back here and talk a little bit about Earthworks as a company. It is a really kind of an interesting company. They take a slightly different approach to microphone design than some other companies. Let me just read to you something that's from their website talking about their philosophy. They say, "We believe there is more to human hearing than the range of frequencies which can be heard as tones. Most sound recordings don't live up to the sonic experience of being there with the live music. We are convinced that audio equipment with extended frequency response and faster, cleaner time domain performance will yield more lifelike results than the slower, more colored equipment of yesteryear. The time resolution of human hearing is 10 microseconds or better. This corresponds to frequencies beyond 80 kilohertz. Most microphones smear frequencies in relation to time to such a degree that the time relationships which existed in the air are audibly degraded. When you choose a microphone, you get its time domain imprint on the track. Mics with poor time resolution will distort the signal beyond any practical recovery of the original. If you don't understand that, don't worry about it. I think in short, the idea is that they're recording a much wider frequency response than most other microphones. They're recording higher frequency waves than most microphones record. And their contention is that if you do that, you're not going to degrade the ones that you can hear as much, like most microphones do. So that's their approach. Does it make a difference? I don't know. What I can say is that this microphone and actually the other Earthworks microphones that I've used, particularly the SR314, do a very nice job, and they do sound quite lifelike. And that's really kind of the hallmark of this particular microphone. Relative to a lot of other broadcast microphones, I feel like this one is a lot more natural sounding. It sounds much more like my actual voice, for better or worse. So let's just kind of run through some of the features of the microphone here, given that context. So first of all, they claim a rise time speed of 11.67 microseconds, which again means that they can capture much wider frequency response with this microphone. And in fact, the specs say that it captures from 20 hertz all the way up to 30 kilohertz. Again, humans generally can't hear beyond 20 kilohertz, but again, because they're capturing that wider range, their contention is it's going to be a more lifelike recording in the waves and the frequencies that you can hear. So it does have a cardioid polar pattern, meaning it is sensitive on the front and less sensitive in the back. So it does a good job of capturing more of what you want to capture and not as much of what you don't want to capture. And what we can see from the polar graph here is that it's not perfectly rejecting every sound in the back. It actually does pick up some of the high frequencies. But in our sample, when we turned the microphone off axis, I think overall it does a pretty good job of keeping things fairly even. The only exception to that is directly behind the microphone. It does pick up a little bit of the kind of mid-high frequencies a little bit. The interesting thing about this is a lot of microphone manufacturers won't tell you this level of detail. They'll just show you a single polar pattern that looks like a heart shape or that looks like a supercardioid shape. They don't tell you how they respond at different frequencies. And that's really, I think, an illustration of the type of meticulous detail that Earthworks pays when they're designing their microphones. When we did our plosives test, when you say the letter P or B into most microphones, you do run the risk of the kind of effect of the whole microphone sort of popping or this sort of explosive sound. And that's because the puff of air that's coming out of your mouth is actually hitting the diaphragm and essentially distorting with a very low frequency sound the recording. And with the built-in cover here, this did just fine. It seemed to do a pretty good job of preventing that. This microphone can handle sound pressure levels up to 139 dB, so you could put it in front of a guitar cabinet if you wanted to. It's not really made for that, but if it strikes your fancy, you could certainly do it. Here's some of the other specifications for the microphone. Everything looks good here. In terms of sensitivity, the good thing is you don't need a super high-end preamplifier that can supply a ton of gain like you would, for example, with the Shure SM7B. You can get away with a much more affordable audio interface or preamplifier and be able to get enough gain for this microphone without a problem. The microphone does come in at 1.5 pounds or 0.68 kilos. It's a pretty substantial piece of kit, and as you probably gathered here, it is made out of solid stainless steel, so it does have a very kind of striking design that can be nice to see. If you are going to have a microphone in your frame, it's nice to have something that looks nice. They've done a nice job on that. The microphone does come with a 2-year warranty, and at the time of this review, comes in at $499 US. Let's move into some of the notes, what I would call notes, or what some people may see as cons. This is not a budget microphone, so if you're looking for a budget microphone, Earthworks is probably not your brand. They really are focused on people that are very demanding of their equipment and that have high expectations and are willing to pay a higher price. So if that's not you, that's fine. There are lots of other options out there. Now, if you're looking for a sort of FM radio announcer, smooth jazz, kind of really bassy, bordering on woofy kind of sound, this is not the microphone for you. It does, as you can see from the frequency response chart here, it does roll off some of the lows, and it did really, really well in terms of proximity effect. You don't get a really kind of woolly sounding proximity effect, even if you're working up close on the microphone, which I think is good. And I think it really suits those kind of situations where you really want to capture accuracy. You want the actual voice to be captured and not a bunch of coloration. From my point of view, this microphone is great. It doesn't overhype anything. What you're hearing is my actual voice, is what I sound like basically in person. So I think that's a really good thing. Now, let's talk about it in relation to the SM7B, which we gave you some samples of, and the SR314, which is a more expensive microphone from Earthworks, also a vocal microphone. In that case, it was originally designed, I think, for music vocals, but I actually use it for my live streams. It's my favorite live streaming microphone. What can we say? If you really do want that kind of bassy FM announcer sound, then this is probably not the microphone for you, as I said before. That's where something like the SM7B, or my personal preference, would be the Earthworks SR314. Now, the SR314 is a $700 microphone, but if you're in it to buy once and cry once and move on and never have to worry about getting another microphone for your dialogue recording or vocals recording, then I think the SR314 is a great option. I would say that I really like the ICON Pro a lot. It's very accurate sounding. It sounds very much like real life. It's not overhyped in the highs or the lows. It is a little bit less bassy than a lot of other broadcast microphones, but I think that can be a good thing because we need a little more variety there. The only thing that I have a complaint about is that Earthworks, for me, has made it very difficult to choose. The ICON Pro is a great microphone. The SR314, which is my standard streaming microphone, I actually love a lot. It's $200 more expensive. And honestly, if it were me, I'd probably find a way to wait and scrape up the additional $200 and go with the SR314. Nevertheless, if you're looking for something very accurate, ICON Pro has got you covered. Now, there is also a USB version of the ICON, just called the Earthworks ICON. It is not exactly the same microphone, at least looking at the specs. I don't have it here, but when I looked at the specs, there are a couple of differences. First of all, it doesn't have the extended frequency response like this one does and the SR314 does. It also cannot handle sound pressure levels that are quite as high as this one can. So there are some differences. That just indicates to me that they're not using the exact same circuitry inside of it. And it is a $350 microphone. So it's mainly made, it is a USB microphone, so there's no XLR output option. And it's really kind of made to connect directly to your computer. So there's a look at the ICON Pro. I hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.